So I'm starting to regret using yellow as a background color because yellow is a really weak color and it's starting to make me feel tired. Um, in fact, in high school, I was captain of my wrestling team, obviously. And we were the worst wrestling team in the entire county. And I think the reason was that our school colors were yellow and brown, basically the color of every excrement you can imagine. And our entire wrestling room was yellow. And I think it just made us weak. And because when we practice at other facilities that were different colors, we were actually a better team for some reason. But anyway, this is actually the last screencast, and we're going to fight through the weakness. This is actually also maybe the most important screencast in the entire semester because along the way, we're going to see the most important graph of the entire semester. Today we're going to be talking about equilibrium, and this is maybe the millionth kind of equilibrium we've seen. So I want you to remember what equilibrium means. It doesn't mean good, it doesn't mean bad, it just means what will be. It means where things are going to settle, what's going to happen, which is going to be useful for us in trying to explain how the economy works and what's going to happen. What we're going to see is that where aggregate demand and aggregate supply meet, that's where equilibrium happens for a lot of the same kind of reasons that it happened in microeconomics. And that level of equilibrium is going to determine the three things that we started caring about at the beginning of the semester, the three ways we measure the economy. In other words, we're going to have a picture of exactly what the economy looks like as measured by the variables that we care about: price level, inflation, GDP, and employment. So we know what aggregate demand looks like, and we know what aggregate supply looks like. Where they meet, the little yellow dot, that's what we're going to call equilibrium. And just to drive the point home, this graph and all of its iterations is the graph of macroeconomics. And remember that there's a very magical place in this graph, right there. Full employment GDP, that's where we want equilibrium to be. Notice in this graph, that's not where it is. Again, equilibrium doesn't mean good or bad. Equilibrium simply means what is. So why does equilibrium happen? Same reasons as in micro, just applied to the economy as a whole. Let's say we're at a price level higher than equilibrium, up at the red line. Follow that red line across and notice where it crosses the aggregate demand and supply curves. Here, aggregate supply is greater than aggregate demand. Or in other words, we're producing more stuff than people are willing to buy. And as that happens, businesses will notice that their inventories start to rise, stuff piling up in their back rooms. That's similar to what a surplus was in microeconomics, but now we have essentially a surplus of everything. And to get rid of that surplus, all that extra stuff, if producers don't want to just stare at it forever, they're going to have to start dropping their prices. They're going to have to start producing less stuff. And that force, that process, is going to push prices back down and push quantities back down, back to equilibrium, the invisible hand. At prices below equilibrium, we get the opposite problem. Demand is greater than supply. We're trying to spend money faster than goods and services are being produced. Businesses would notice those inventories starting to fall. We're taking stuff off the shelves faster than they can put stuff on the shelves. And producers would respond to that. They'd respond by producing more, but they would also respond by increasing prices. And again, we get that invisible hand force that pushes us back to equilibrium. Well, again, equilibrium is simply what will be. And over the last couple of screencasts, we saw that aggregate demand and aggregate supply can move. And if you forgot, it's probably useful to review what makes them move. And when either one of those two curves move, we're going to get a different meeting point. We're going to get a different equilibrium. And this is important enough to explore basically every possibility. So let's start with a graph that looks like this. Let's say that this is where equilibrium was happening. You should be able to tell that this is not where we want to be. This is not near full employment. So we might be in a recession if the equilibrium looked like this. In this case, if aggregate demand moved to the right, it would be a purely good thing. Notice what happens to GDP. Notice what happens to employment. They both go up. Moreover than that, is that an expression? Price level hasn't gone up at all. We're getting two good things happening without any bad thing happening. If we start in the intermediate portion of the graph, and that was a nice little voice crack, and aggregate demand were moved to the right, again, that's good. We're getting even closer to full employment and even more GDP. But notice here we're starting to pay a price, and that price literally is price. Price level is starting to go up. If the babies are on gerbil wheels and we're in that really unlikely range of aggregate supply represented by the vertical part, and aggregate demand were to increase again, notice what happens to GDP. Nothing. And notice what happens to employment. Nothing. We're already at our economy's absolute capacity to produce stuff. And so here, if people try to spend more money, no more stuff's going to be produced. All that's going to happen is that prices are going to go up. Well, it says it on the screen, but review it from the beginning. When we start with aggregate demand, as aggregate demand moves to the right, GDP goes up, employment goes up, but also prices go up. And we've seen that before. We call that demand pull inflation. Inflation that happens because people are spending more money. This movement of aggregate demand to the right along the aggregate supply curve also kind of solves a mystery that we saw back in the last unit. Remember the multiplier, the idea that a little spending turns into a lot of spending. I spend some money at your store, you take that money and spend it at someone else's store, etc. And remember that the higher the marginal propensity to consume, the higher the MPC, the bigger that multiplier effect was. If everyone spends 90% of the money that they get, more spending happens than if everyone's taking 10% of the money that they get and spending that. And we left kind of hanging open the question, well, what would happen if everyone's MPC was 100%? What if everyone just took all of the money that they got and spent it all, didn't save anything? I took $10 from you, I spent $10 at your store, you took my $10 and spent it at someone else's store. Well, the problem with that is that it would turn into an infinite amount of spending. And we kind of left open in the last unit how that was possible. Well, the answer is it's not possible, and you can see why from this graph. If we start on the horizontal part of the graph and people try to spend more money, we will get that full multiplier effect. But notice what happens to GDP as aggregate demand increases again by the same amount. Let's say we try to spend even more money. Notice that aggregate demand shifts to the right by the same amount, but notice that that change in GDP, that change in real stuff being produced, is a little bit smaller now. That multiplier effect is getting weakened because part of that increase in spending isn't getting translated into more stuff, it's getting translated into higher prices. And if we were to increase aggregate demand even more, notice again that the change in GDP is even smaller now. Now we're just getting higher and higher prices, really, with a very little increase in stuff being produced. So the multiplier effect works, but it works better on the horizontal part of the aggregate supply curve. Because as you move to the right in the graph, more and more of that the increase in spending is just being translated into higher prices. All right, that was a little, not really a caveat, but kind of an in-depth explanation of what was going on there. Let's revisit our curve shifting. We saw what happens if aggregate demand shifts right. What if it shifts left? Well, if it shifts left far enough, that's what we call a recession. Really low levels of GDP, really low levels of employment. Notice we're very, very far away from that magical place in the graph. Now, most of this semester is going to be about aggregate demand moving in one way or another. But it is important to recognize that it's possible for aggregate supply to move as well. When aggregate supply shifts to the right, it is the best of all possible worlds. And you can notice that from what's going on in terms of equilibrium price level, GDP, and employment. Here we have GDP going up, that's good. Employment going up, that's good. And notice that prices aren't going up now, prices are actually going down. If you've ever heard the expression supply-side economics, this is really what they're referring to. And it gets mischaracterized a lot. Sometimes it's called trickle-down economics, and it's characterized as giving rich people money so that maybe they'll spend it and help poor people. That's not really what it's about. Supply-side economics is about moving the aggregate supply curve to the right. Go back to the last screencast and remember what does that. Resource prices, productivity, but also the legal institutional environment. If the government, according to the supply-siders, can cut business taxes, reduce regulations, make it easier for businesses, aggregate supply shifts to the right and we get all these wonderful effects. For similar reasons, in reverse, if aggregate supply shifts to the left, it's the worst of all possible worlds. Notice that GDP drops, employment drops, and we actually get inflation. In this case, cost push inflation. That kind of inflation that happens when costs go up to producers and they push those higher costs down onto consumers. So if you do the reverse of what the supply-siders are saying, raise taxes on businesses, increase regulations, make it harder for businesses, you see what happens in this macroeconomic model. Sometimes, if aggregate supply shifts to the left, we call that stagflation. What stagflation means is that not only are we getting this bad inflation, but we're also getting a recession, low levels of employment and GDP. So we're getting stagnation and inflation, stagflation. All right, that pretty much wraps it up for this unit. It's a short one, but it's a really important one. And where we're going from here is to see how the government, first off, can manipulate this little model, kind of like a machine, by moving around these curves. All right, later.
This is Annie here on the top, and Annie is 3 months old.
Or do you keep them separate?
They probably could. The problem is we don't get very many three things.
Babies.
Yeah, the two we have that
They're
they're just